The U.S. population has just passed an important demographic marker this year. It finally reached 300 million. The reactions to the news were predictable. Many on the left celebrated the growing diversity of the population, while many on the right came to the defense of a rising population for fear that the news would be spun in favor of social policies with which they disagree. Environmentalists like Vicky Markham of the Center for the Environment and Population regretted that people are wreaking havoc on the environment. If by wreaking havoc she means transforming it to the good of the human population, this is a point that might be made about Adam and Eve. But there were two considerations not addressed, and they're the most fundamental ones. First, what kind of economy is necessary to support this level of population? After all, whether a rising population is good or bad depends on the capacity of the economic structures to support the people's well-being. Second, why should it be necessary for all those people to have to live under the same central government? Let's address the first question. A population of 300 million is about 5% of the world's population today. But it probably was the whole of the world's population 1,000 years ago. The dramatic emergence of complex capital structures in the late Middle Ages and the Industrial Revolution led to the most explosively large increases in human well-being ever recorded. No pharaoh or Caesar lived as well as the poor today in the United States. The vital statistics tell a similar story, as each generation since the development of complex capital structures has lived better than the previous one. The free market is the most pro-life policy of all. If we could somehow transport the whole population of today back a millennium ago, with the level of technology and capital present at that time, what would be the results? Nothing short of mass starvation. While it is true that people are a resource, even the ultimate resource, people still must be fed, clothed, and housed. This would not be possible with the present level of population, with the existing state of economic development 1,000 years ago. Yet there are many people today who long for a system of economics that prevailed in the Middle Ages. On the left, we have the neo-Rousseauians, who imagine that modern technology has a hopelessly corrupting effect, while on the right, some dream of a guild-dominated system of small craftsmen and home-based production. But these fantasies are not only unworkable, in reality, they are nothing short of lethal. Most of the world's population would die immediately if such a system were imposed. There is only one system that can support a national and world population on this scale. And it is not socialism, it's not primitivism, it is only capitalism. Moreover, no form of government can create wealth. So we need not credit the Constitution except to the extent that it has justified the curbing of government's reach. Nor can we credit any political leader. So let's not hear about the glories of great presidents. It is capitalism alone that has supported this level of population growth and keeps it contributing to the common good. And by naming capitalism as the benefactor of mankind, I also intend to include the many millions of entrepreneurs, workers, savers, and investors who pushed forward economic growth. Now, someone might quickly respond that the welfare state does its share of work. But keep in mind that the welfare state produces nothing. It lives off wealth already created, wealth taken by force. Redistribution of wealth does not create wealth. It only shuffles it around from its most economically suitable uses towards purposes that serve the needs of the political class. If any property is made to serve anything other than its first most suitable purpose, its value is reduced. When it is channeled into purposes that serve the interests of the state, it is done at the cost of freedom as well. And yet in all the discussion of this landmark of population, I didn't hear a word about the critical question of how it is that all these people can be supported. Indeed, the very source of wealth in society gets hardly any press at all. People act as if a given level of prosperity is like the weather. It appears and disappears in a manner that is largely beyond human control. This is precisely what good economic education seeks to correct. It must draw attention to both the question and the answer. This is what good economists have been doing since the 14th century and before. And then as now, the press that capitalism gets is usually of a negative nature. We hear about businessmen going to jail, about food manufacturers trying to poison our children, about fraudulent and unlicensed professionals, about rapacity and greed. Partly because of this propaganda, capitalism today is hamstrung, taxed, regulated, regimented, distorted, and twisted in 100 million ways. And yet it remains the one and only source of wealth that serves to feed, clothe, and house the growing multitudes of the American population. 100 years ago, when the U.S. population passed the 100 million mark, there was much talk about many subjects concerning growth, but one subject was not raised, and this is the very subject that dominated the headlines this year, the environment. There seems to be some sort of consensus, one that is not open to dispute, that a growing population is a disaster for the environment. Now, when speaking of this question of the environment, it's good to clarify our terms. If by the environment, for example, we mean clean air, I can promise you there is no surer way to clean the air than air conditioning. And this is distinctly a product of the human population. The same can be said of water. A rising population engaged in the capitalist project of bottling water to sell is a great path to clean water. Nature, left to its own devices, is cruel and dirty. But many people don't see it this way. For them, the best environment is the one that is utterly uninhabited. This dream provides a strangely perverse justification for socialist policies, the end result of which is finally poverty and death. The New Scientist, for example, has published an article oddly titled, "Imagine Earth Without Humans." Quote, "Humans are undoubtedly the most dominant species on the Earth," the article begins. "In just a few thousand years, we've swallowed up more than a third of the planet's land for our cities, farmland, and pastures. By some estimates, we now commandeer 40% of its productivity. And we're leaving quite a mess behind," says the New Scientist. "Plowed up prairies, raised forests, drained aquifers, nuclear waste, chemical pollution, invasive species, mass extinctions, and now the looming specter of climate change. If they could, the other species we share the earth would surely vote us off the planet." Now just suppose they got their wish, the article continues. Imagine that all the people on earth, all 6.5 billion of us and counting, could be spirited away tomorrow, transported to a re-education camp in a far-off galaxy. Left once more to its own devices, nature would begin to reclaim the planet, as fields and pastures reverted to prairies and forests. The air and water cleansed themselves of pollutants, and roads and cities crumbled back to dust, unquote. Of course, no article that seems to long for the end of humanity would be complete without a quotation from an expert scientist. So here it is, quote, "The sad truth is, once the humans get out of the picture, the outlook starts to look a lot better," says John Orrock, a conservation biologist at the National Center for Ecological Analysis in Santa Barbara, California. We can gather from this statement that there is at least one form of extinction that some environmentalists would not entirely regret. The irony is that the policies of the environmentalists have moved far beyond the early conservation movement that saw merit in the wonders of the Grand Canyon or the California redwoods. It has become an all-encompassing political ideology that argues against the well-being of people and on behalf of anything non-human. In its reductio ad absurdum, it aspires to the extinction of the human race, and in its politics, it works to kill off the source of prosperity and thereby works towards that extinction in bits and pieces. The truth is that this country has entirely too much unused nature, as is obvious when you take a coast-to-coast flight. From a bird's eye view, this country is hardly overcrowded, a fact which is also underscored in detailed maps. Indeed, most of the landmass of the United States is empty. Our population density is far lower than the rest of the world, especially that of Asia, Latin America, and Europe. And yet you can't make that kind of statement in American politics and expect any kind of assent.